This podcast is part of the Tremula Network, adventure and outdoor podcasts off the beaten track. To find out more, head to tremula.network or find us on socials. Hello there, and welcome to Wild for Scotland, a podcast full of inspiring stories from Scotland. I'm your host, Kathi Kamleitner. Wild for Scotland helps you connect with Scotland and dream about future adventures. I'll tell you immersive stories to whisk you away, share some of my top tips for your own Scotland trip, and introduce you to inspiring locals and their stories. So lean back and enjoy. Let's travel to Scotland. We're heading back to the Highlands today, where I meet the storyteller and nature enthusiast Sarah Hobbs of Strathspey Storywalks. Sarah runs guided walks through the countryside of Strathspey and Badenoch and tells stories along the way. Folk tales and histories, myths and legends, her walks connect visitors with the land and its people of the present and the past. I felt incredibly fortunate to meet Sarah during my trip to Badenoch and get a taste of one of her story walks. Sarah also learns Gaelic, which, if that's something you're interested in, you should definitely go through our feed and listen to my conversation with Callum McLean in Season 3. We talk about Scottish Gaelic, and Callum shares lots of great resources to learn it. I actually started learning Gaelic on Duolingo at the start of this year, and it's really great fun. But back to my conversation with Sarah. We met on a moody day near the banks of the River Spey, and Sarah took me on a walk through the woods. Along the way, we stopped frequently so she could tell me stories about the places we passed. There were stories about trees and mushrooms, mythical creatures and historical figures. But of course, I also asked her to tell me a little bit more about herself and her work. So let's hear it from Sarah Hobbs.
I'm Sarah Hobbs, she, her, and I run Strathspey Storywalks, which is sort of a quite informal little guided walks that sort of explore an area in depth, really. It's trying to make quite a deep connection to exploring all the layers that exist within a place. So it includes things like storytelling, folklore, and history and culture, and a bit of Gaelic, and how that links to the sort of ecology and nature, and with a bit of foraging as well. So it's kind of exploring how all of these layers interact with each other, basically.
How does one get into storytelling?
Sort of by accident. I mean, the walks I started a couple of years ago during the pandemic, kind of as a sanity project, really, to stop me from going insane in the house. And just because I'd spent a lot of time doing research. I mean, a lot of these things are my interests anyway, and I just thought, do you know what, there's so much here in terms of stories or, folklore, and I don't see it anywhere, I don't hear it anywhere. And this area, Strathspey and Badenoch, is so rich in stories that it is a shame that it isn't being shared on a regular basis and in a way to continue the oral tradition. So that was something that was very important to me. There are quite a lot of books, but I wanted to try and continue or reinvigorate the oral tradition of stories being passed down by ear. So I kind of just fell into it and started running walks, and people really loved them, and so I continued to run walks.
Did you have a background? Did you have a background in storytelling before, or in historical research, or in folklore research? Or where did that interest come from?
I mean, reading and writing were, I suppose, my passions from when I was very, very small. But in terms of storytelling, it's quite interesting. So certainly not in terms of or really telling stories. I didn't have much of a background in that at all, but my entire working life, the thread of my entire working life, was basically working with communities, usually minority communities or people whose voices we don't hear very often, or they're quite hidden, and working with them to, I guess, amplify their voices and their experiences for social change, for positive social change, for systemic social change, actually. So it's strange. So it's kind of a continuation of that, all of the voices and experiences that are here and just bringing it to the fore a bit more. Yeah.
Because, Highland culture and Highland folklore and mythology is something that, had been oppressed for many years as well, and had been forbidden or had been outlawed. And I guess particularly that oral tradition was vital for that to survive.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting in terms of comparing that to, for example, England, where there is an oral tradition, but particularly in the Highlands, because it was so strong, but it was the stories from, everyday, normal working people. That was the oral tradition. Whereas in England, for example, because writing had existed for so long, it was always those in power who were writing. And so that's what survived. Whereas here, what survived is the stories of the ordinary working people. And the songs, of course, and the tunes. And all of those go together.
It's really fascinating to think about that difference between the North and the South.
Yeah.
And then thinking how important the Gaelic language and the Gaelic culture probably is as well in such a rural area. As you walk through the countryside here and the landscape, or learn about different place names, what I find so nice about Gaelic is that it always comes with a story, and the place names aren't just descriptive or useful, they actually tell a story about the place. And that captures so much of what that place meant, what people believed in, and how they formed relationship with the land as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It's very much here. It's very much the language of the land, which is what led me to begin learning it in the first place, because I wanted to know how to pronounce the things and I wanted to know what they meant. And I totally agree. As soon as you start learning, you realise that really there isn't a tree or a rock or a hill, a little bump that doesn't come with a story. And it's still only a snapshot of a particular time, but it's extremely, they can be very descriptive, or they can be, full on mythology, or they can be telling you something about the previous occupants or whatever it is. And it's this amazing tapestry of layers, and I just think it's wonderful. So we just happened to be at a rowan tree just now, and it's quite a unique rowan in that it's got 3 trunks and it's got 2 arches. The 3 trunks are intertwined and to create 2 arches, a double arch rowan, which is really, really quite unusual. But in terms of the link with Gaelic, the original Gaelic alphabet, each letter was a tree. And that just, to me, it just emphasises how much people were linked to trees and the land and how important they were. It was just such a crucial thing. And rowan's a protection tree. So we're on an old croft site just now. So in this area in Strathspey, possibly in Bainoch as well, the wives of Strathspey would drive their animals through the trees twice a year at Beltane, so May Day, for good luck and protection for the coming season. And then they'd move up. So after Beltane, they'd move up to the Sheelings, to the summer farms, where the grazing was good for the animals. The women and the girls would do that and do all their dairy making up there for the summer. And then they'd come back down at Samhain or Halloween, and again they would drive their animals through the tree. So I suspect that this tree is here on this croft site because people were physically taking their animals through the tree.
Wow.
For good luck.
It's a big gap, but big enough for...
It's big enough for cattle, yeah.
Wow.
One at a time.
Yeah.
Well, there's one arch that's a decent size, and there's one arch that, you would have to be a very skinny cow to get through that.
I guess the cattle was maybe also smaller back in those days than
possibly.
it is now.
The black cat. Yeah. They certainly weren't Yeah, they certainly weren't the monstrosities we see in.
But if it was Highland cows, then they would get stuck with their horns, no?
I suspect it wasn't Highland cows.
Yeah.
It was mostly black cattle in the Highlands,
Yeah.
and that was the wealth of the Highlands, really, with these black cattle. And they would drive them to markets in the south, and they would plant trees along the way as way markers, particularly Scots pines, so they could see the way.
And as a storyteller, that must be quite inspiring to then be surrounded by those kinds of landscapes and those kinds of stories the entire time.
Hugely, yeah. And I think a lot of it is also trying to collect the stories in that, I mean, a lot of them have been collected already and exist in, like the archives of the Highland Folk Museum, for example, or in people's memories. I mean, yeah, because we're not necessarily talking about ancient history. We're still talking about history that, people's grannies would have told them, and in books. So it's just bringing all of these things together. Oh, mushroom. I'm like, squirrel. Bringing all of these threads together into something that will then make sense and be memorable to people, I think, or just sort of prods them to think, okay, there's actually so much here that, we could just be walking through the woods right now, but actually there's a whole story about the railway. There's whole stories of these, in these woods where people have lived for thousands of years in many different ways, with the ruins and whatnot. So, there's lots of things. There's always lots of things. And the trees, and then the old maps that I found of these woods and what trees used to be here. And then what grows on the trees and what grows under the trees and what the trees grow with. And so it kind of depends what you mean by a story, because all of those to me are also stories in a way. Oh, and I've just spotted a possible fly, Garrett. Nice.
Hello, Wild for Scotland listeners. I am Fran Turauskis, and if you enjoy the storytelling episodes of Wild for Scotland, I want to tell you about another podcast in the Trembler Network. Seize Your Adventure is for people who want to explore the whole spectrum of adventure. But Seize Your Adventure is more than an adventure sports podcast, because all of the guests and storytellers throughout the series live the adventure lifestyle whilst also living with epilepsy. You'll get to hear stories about long-distance hiking, skiing in snowstorms, and camping under the stars. But there are interviews that dive into the hidden aspects of taking on adventures with epilepsy. So if you're after a podcast that inspires, entertains, and encourages you to take part in the adventure lifestyle, search for Seize Your Adventure in your podcast app to find out more.
So, how do you collect your stories? How do the stories get to you?
Yeah, in lots of different ways and lots of different places. I mean, it could be when I'm out and about and I see something a bit odd, like the rowan, actually. That just came from, you notice things that aren't quite right, or not that aren't quite right, but you notice things are a little bit odd in the landscape, and then you start doing more research on them. Or, I might go to the archives. The Highland Historical Environment Record, for example, is really useful for providing sort of the historical basis of little snippets, and then you think, oh, okay, it's mentioning this, and then you go off down about a million rabbit holes in my case. Or it could be from archives in the Highland Folk Museum, sort of letters, and then books of all ages. There's the more recent ones, is from more recent storytellers, and then there's also folkloric books that people started sort of collecting stories really in the last 100 years or so, or maybe 150. And then there's sort of the older, more historical books as well.
What do you enjoy about telling stories?
So for a start, I only like to tell, ideally, stories outdoors, outside, because most of the stories, a vast majority, if not all of the stories I tell, are about place. They're place-based. They're about a specific place that we might be in now, or I can point to it on a hill, or there are trees around that link to the story, and I can point to them, and I can get you to taste something of the tree or whatever. So it's making all those connections, and it's putting things in place in the landscape that people can then understand. Very much. I mean, I do tell storytelling. I do storytelling indoors as well, but it's just a totally different experience. Yeah, so when I'm doing that and I'm pointing to everything and just I think the looks on people's faces, I just love, and I don't get bored of it. Like I can feel like I'm like totally lighting up now, like thinking of people's faces when you make things make sense to them and they see the entire landscape in a totally different way because of something, very short that you've just been able to share with them, which is very wonderful. And I don't think I'll get bored of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably something I enjoy most about storytelling myself, even though I don't tell stories outside. I tell them in front of my computer and record them in a podcast microphone. But once I then layer the sound effects into it and really create that sense of place and being in that location, I don't necessarily like listening back to the story and to myself, but the sounds and closing my eyes and remembering what it was like in that place, that's something that I love sharing and love passing on to others, whether they have been in that same place as me or not, whether they're only experiencing it through the story. It's such a lovely gift to share with people.
It is, yeah, the connection. And I think, we were talking about connection a bit earlier as well. So, yeah, those connections, I mean, certainly all of these stories and all of these things that I hugely change. I mean, I'm talking from a very personal perspective now, but they've hugely changed my relationship with the land, which is what I always aimed for in a way. I just wanted to get to know a place very deeply and in lots of different ways, and to see how all of those things interact with each other. And as soon as you know a story about a place, a particular place, let's say, it totally changes your perspective of it. You feel like you will never see it in the same way again. It changes your literal view of it. And I think that's quite important. Like when I was in Skye twice this year, and I've never taken to Skye at all. It's really dramatic and I enjoy going every time, but I had never really had a personal relationship with it. And I spent 4 days walking, and I took a book with me from my favourite folklorist, Otta Sawyer. And I had her book and her stories, and they totally accompanied me on the way. So I felt so joyful and not at all alone, because I had Otter, but I also had, Oscar, the warrior of the Fianna, like one of the warriors of the Fianna, and his stone, for example. Or I had, stories about waterfalls. So there was just so many ways in which I could see the landscape, which was good because the weather was dire. But I had the most brilliant time, even though the weather was dire. And I'm not sure that I passed so many walkers who were doing the same walk as me, but the other way, and they just looked so depressed and so damp and so knackered and just wanted to get home. And I just felt really inspired by everything. Yeah.
I think it's one thing, we can see the landscapes, and as we drive through Strathspey and Badenoch, we see all the mountains and we see all the rivers and the forest and the lochs and the glens. But that's not really enough for that personal relationship. And I think the stories just put the people in it. They put the people in the landscape that we can then relate to on a very, very different level.
Yeah, or the fairies or the giants or the gods or whoever it is, But that's still far more tangible than just a bare landscape with maybe a few horses in it now, or a few cattle, or a moorland, I would agree with that.
Can I ask you, how long have you been based in this area?
Yeah, so almost 7 years now. Yeah, and it was the reindeer that brought me up here, actually. Well, the reindeer and the hills and the people. I just loved how Highlanders were so quiet and humble, but open and friendly at the same time. It's a nice mix of people who ended up here. So yeah, I thought I'm quite a hill person. I grew up in the hills in England and in the Peak Districts, and then lived in Norway for a couple of years, and I just always knew I wanted to be in the mountains. So yeah, that's what brought me up originally.
It's a good choice. I'm sure there's going to be a few listeners who 20 seconds ago went like, what? Reindeer? Who might have never heard about the reindeer of Scotland.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a herd of reindeer that free roam the Cairngorm Mountains, and they were reintroduced. I mean, at one point reindeer lived in Scotland and in the Highlands, and there was a Swedish Sami reindeer herder who came to Scotland on his honeymoon, and he basically spent the whole of his honeymoon running around the mountains looking for reindeer because the landscape was so similar to where he was from in northern Sweden. And of course he didn't find any because they, died out hundreds of years before. But he essentially decided to reintroduce them. So since 1952, there's been reindeer running around the Cairngorms. It's quite a small herd. It's it's around 150, and they're split over 2 sites as well. So yes, actual reindeer in the Cairngorms.
I've never seen them. I knew they were there, but I've never actually went and gone to see them. Because you can, obviously they're free roaming, but some of them are at the reindeer centre, is that right?
Yes, yeah, there's always some down in Glenmore, just a few. And then the rest of them will be up on the hill. And there's a big hill enclosure that they take visitors to. But then the rest of the herd are free roaming. And it depends on at different times of year. But I mean, the Cairngorms is the only bit of Britain that's a subarctic climate, so it is the perfect environment for reindeer to live. It's the only bit of Britain really where reindeer would be super happy. So yeah, I think.
And that is due to the plateau, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So they seem pretty happy. They're also pretty lazy. Like you might be able to see them from time to time on Cairngorm car park begging for sandwiches.
Well, they're not stupid.
No, they learn quickly.
They know, yeah. Oh wow, a big group of mushrooms.
Yeah, I don't know what they are, unfortunately. It almost looks like a ring though. As in, there's some sort of fairy ring, but I don't know what they are at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very pretty. I love coming up to the Cairngorms. I don't do it as often as I would like to.
Yeah.
It is quite a far drive from Glasgow. But it's such a beautiful area, and it's so different, really, than anywhere else in Scotland. Yeah. I find it so unique. And I've really thoroughly enjoyed spending time in the Badenoch area and actually staying locally and not just doing a day trip or a quick stopover.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's funny actually, when you said that, it reminded me of I did a residency, I was going to say a couple of years ago. It was perhaps only last year. My sense of time has gone really haywire since the pandemic. Anyway, possibly last year, possibly the year before, I did a residency in a wee bothy.
Oh, with the bothy project?
Yeah, with the project, cool. Just in Triech, which is very, very close to Aviemore. It's perhaps, 5 miles max, something like that. And just staying in that specific place for 4 days or so was so totally different to Aviemore. And the stories of that place were totally different, and the atmospheres of the place or the places around there were totally different. But you would never get that from just a day trip. You have to be in a place for several days and be exploring and really get to know it. And it put me in the mind to do sort of super local holidays, like literally just a few miles away.
What do you love about the Badenoch area specifically? Or is there anything that you wish people knew that you would just want to tell them?
I think the place, you very much make your own personal relationships with it, and I found my way and I love it, and there's always so much more to learn, but I don't presume that other people will have the same experience. I guess I like Badenoch because it's again, actually, even compared to Strathspey, the landscapes are really different. It's much more kind of, I find it much more wide open and sweeping. You've got the jumping off point to go up into Glenfeshie or onto the plateau, or in fact, either side. You've got some really good pubs. You've got some, distilleries, and then you've got all the stories and all of it's just quite, I don't know, it's a good mix of all things, I think. Yeah. That was not a good answer.
No, you know what? That's a perfect answer, because that's exactly what this is about for me, or my work with Visit Cairngorms. It is about, you can visit one area and you can see so many different aspects of Scottish culture in one location, and I think Badenoch really has that. Yeah. But it flies so much under the radar. Yeah. People don't really know about it. I didn't really know about it to my shame. Yeah. To be quite honest. Yeah. But it's such a lovely area.
Yeah, I just think being just right on the edge of the Cairngorms is so dramatic. And again, from a personal point of view, it's never the same. I mean, the weather conditions are always so different that you can look out and not see a thing, or you can look out and you can see these dramatic wisps of cloud on top of the hills, or it's just constantly changing, which again changes your experience. And yeah, I personally love that.
And I think you do have a different element of community here as well, because in the Western Highlands it can very often feel like the glens are empty. And of course they aren't, and the ones that are so for a very good reason, and for very sad reasons.
Yeah.
Whereas I find here, because everything is kind of between those mountain ranges, the life that still happens all happens in that kind of valley. So you're kind of exposed to it in a very different way in those vibrant villages.
Yeah, there is a fair bit happening, definitely, and there's museums and
Shinty.
a bit of shinty, exactly. Oh my goodness, and Kingacy just won the Camanachd Cup, which is very exciting, but I still see it as an empty landscape. Actually, like compared to what it was, it is still an empty landscape. And yeah, it might be comparatively less empty than the West Highlands, but again, that would have been a very, very full landscape. You probably, in terms of crofts and townships that used to be here, you honestly probably wouldn't walk more than 5 or 10 minutes before you came across your neighbour, which is quite
different
something to think of. Yeah, in terms of patterns of population and whatnot, it is quite different.
That is very true. Can you tell me a little bit about the walks people can take with you, and what to expect from a storytelling walk with you?
Yeah, so the walks, I like them to be very informal, and so they're really quite slow. I guess it's more of a slow adventure type thing, because we're looking at things all the time, or we're tasting things all the time, so yeah, there's people can book different routes. I've got a route in Aviemore, there's a route in Dalnavert. There'll be more routes coming out by the end of the year. But also equally, if people want a walk in a specific place, they can just ask that. But it's very much about seasonality and, telling stories based on the seasons, and eating what we find based on the seasons as well. So yeah, we do a fair bit of tree foraging, which is it's interesting because people don't often think of the trees, and they're here all the time, and particularly something like a Scots pine, the needles are there all year round, so it's quite a good one to needles in general. So conifers are really good to forage, because with the exception of yew, which is poisonous, they've all got really distinct and really quite amazing taste. Well, yeah, some spruce less so, to be fair, but they're all, you can try them all, and they're incredibly different. They're all quite citrusy, and then they've all got their all different like specific. So there's Scots pine's just generally quite aromatic and quite gentle. There's Douglas fir, which is that's very aromatic. That actually it's like Christmas to me. It's almost like of tangerines, that sort of spicy smell in the house. That's like Douglas fir to me. There's one called Western hemlock, which is no relation to hemlock the plant, which tastes a bit like grapefruit. That's one of my favourites. So yeah, there's lots of trees to eat, birch leaves as well, and then potentially mushrooms. I don't necessarily forage for mushrooms on the walks, but we look at them and we ID them and we talk about them. And then depending on the season as well, we all stop. Well, no, not all year. I do like a wild forage tea for people. So we'll go to a very special place, which is, sometimes it's the Neolithic cairn or it's a fairy hill or whatever it is, and we stop and have tea. And depending on the season, it could be heather tea, or it could be a needle tea, some mix of needle tea, or it could be chaga, which is the mushroom that grows on birch trees. Fungus or rather. Yeah, so it's a mix of different things on the walk. It's stories and history and a bit of Gaelic. Gaelic's always good. A bit of cultural, I guess, community practice, what communities would have done in terms of living with the seasons and with the year, with the cycles of the year. And yeah, naturey stuff. Good mix.
What is the best way for people to come and join you on a walk?
So people can book on my website. It's storywalks.scot. And yeah, there are walks all year round, at least once a week. And otherwise, I'm on social media as Strathspey Storywalks, and people are very welcome to just drop me a message and ask me anything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time today, for taking me on a walk, telling stories and sharing some of your passions for Strathspey and the Badenoch area with us.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Sarah Hobbs of Strathspey Storywalks for taking me out on a walk on the River Spey and sharing so many fascinating stories with me. If you support our podcast on Patreon, you'll get to hear a few more of them in this month's bonus episode. Head to wildforscotland.com/support to learn how to join. You can connect with Sarah on social media at Strathspey Storywalks and book onto one of her walks via her website. She's also available for private groups if you can't find a date that works for you. My conversation with Sarah was the perfect way to round off my trip to Badenoch, and also our focus on the region on the podcast. If you feel inspired by last week's stories or today's chat with Sarah, head to my Scotland travel blog and use my detailed Badenoch travel guide to plan your trip. Next week, we'll continue our focus on Scottish stories, although we're changing our location and head back to the West Coast. I hope you'll tune in again. Thank you so much for listening to Wild for Scotland. We're always keen to hear your feedback, so if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much. Wild for Scotland is part of the Tremula Network, adventure and outdoor podcasts off the beaten path. The show is written and hosted by me, Kathi Kamleitner. Thanks to Fran Turauskis, who's the co-producer and editor and does the sound design, and to Kirsty Spain, who helps with transcripts and social media. Podcast art is by Lizzie Vaughan-Knight, the Tartan Trail Burner, and all original music is composed by Bruce Wallace. Until next time, when we travel to a different place in Scotland.